We're a couple of minutes past 6, so we'll kick off with our webinar. So thank you everybody for taking the time to join us from across the country. This is the second of the industry webinars on foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease, and thank you to everybody for joining. Up front, it's very clear to state again that Australia is free from foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease, and our priority is to absolutely keep it that way. And the evidence of our historical performance in keeping out exotic animal diseases and the performance of our biosecurity systems is very good. And we have a lot of confidence in those systems, but it's also important that we do everything we can to further strengthen them. And I know that's where many of you see so many of those efforts now. I'm Jason Strong, I'm the Managing Director of Meat and Livestock Australia, and I'll be moderating this evening's webinar. And the focus of this evening's session is to have a practical look at the available information and tools to support industry preparedness in the case of an exotic disease outbreak. So on the agenda, we've got 3 speakers. So Elizabeth Bradley, who's the Manager of Quality Policy and Compliance at the Integrity Systems Company. And Elizabeth will outline the importance of how we record our livestock movements on the NLIS database, and also explaining how to check how your livestock are recorded, what livestock are recorded on your pick, and how to update the database if there are movements that are missing. We'll then have Rob Barwell from Animal Health Australia, and Rob's going to talk about how it can help to minimise the spread of animal diseases and also play a key role in the early detection of exotic disease threats through the implementation of an effective on-farm biosecurity plan. And then we'll have Dr. Samantha Allen, who's the General Manager of Emergency Preparedness at Animal Health, of Animal Health and Biosecurity at Animal Health Australia. And she's going to provide an overview of activities performed in that first 72 hours following an emergency animal disease outbreak, so including a livestock stance to be aware of. So we'll have quite a bit of time at the end for a Q&A, so we'll work through the speakers one after each other, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So we've got, we should have more than half an hour for questions and answers at the end. And due to the large number of people that we have on these webinars, everybody's muted at the moment, so please put your questions in the chat function, and they'll be picked up from there. And any that we don't get to answer tonight, and if the first webinar is any indication, there's likely to be quite a few, we'll make sure we provide answers to those afterwards in the follow-up communication. The webinar is being recorded and it'll be shared out through the industry communication channels. So as we kick off, Australia has some of the strictest biosecurity protocols in the world, and our industry's invested hundreds of millions of dollars to develop lifetime traceability systems to protect us in the case of the exotic disease incursion. And while FMD has been a threat to our industry for more than 100 years, its recent spread reinforces just how vigilant we have to be. And to kick us off for tonight's discussion, I'll hand over to Elizabeth to get us underway.
Great, thanks, Jason. So I'm going to talk about why accurate livestock movement records and traceability is so important, especially in the event of an emergency animal disease outbreak, such as foot and mouth or lumpy skin disease. You might notice that some of the information I'm about to share is about the current integrity system requirements of NLIS and LPA, but that's exactly why we have these systems in place. So to start off, why is traceability so important? Well, it actually assists us in quickly responding and mitigating disease spread. If a disease like foot and mouth or LSD is detected, we can find out where infected animals are located, where they have been, and then determine if other animals have been in contact with them. We can then stop impacted livestock moving further in order to isolate and contain the spread of the diseases. If our traceability data isn't accurate, FMD or LSD could be spreading without us knowing about it or being contained, which is really quite serious. The National Livestock Identification System, or the NLIS, is Australia's system for the identification and traceability of cattle, sheep and goats. NLIS is a legislative requirement which is enforced by each state and territory, and it requires livestock to be identified and their movements recorded in the NLIS database. The traceability data entered into the database allows us to perform livestock tracing. The use of livestock movement records such as National Vendor Declarations, or NVDs, are also important livestock movement records that assist us in the event of disease outbreaks. Integrity System Companies provides the NLIS database for use and also administers the Livestock Production Assurance Program, or LPA. And producers must be accredited under LPA to use NVDs, which must be completed when moving livestock off properties. Meeting the requirements of NLIS and LPA will help ensure you're prepared in the event of a disease outbreak. However, I'm going to outline the specific things you can do in relation to NLIS and LPA to make sure that you're prepared. The NLIS consists of three central components: animal identification, property identification codes or PICs, and recording livestock movements in the database. So I'm going to step through each of these components and provide some tips on what you can do to be prepared. PICs are allocated by states and territories, and producers must have a valid PIC in order to have an NLIS account, be LPA accredited, order NLIS identification devices, and move livestock on and off a property. PICs represent the location of livestock and are important as regulators can assign a status to a PIC to identify it as an infected property during a disease outbreak. A tip that producers can do is ensure that your PIC is valid, especially if you've recently sold, bought or leased a property, and ensure your contact details are current with your relevant state or territory department. This is so they can be in contact with you in the event of an emergency disease outbreak. Animal identification is the next component of NLIS. Identification of animals with an accredited NLIS device is also a legal requirement. Cattle, sheep and goats must be identified with an NLIS accredited tag from their property of birth before they leave the property, or a replacement tag if it's been damaged or lost. When an NLIS accredited tag is purchased, it's uploaded to the database as an active tag for use on that PIC. Cattle must have an electronic identification device, or an EID. Currently, sheep and goats can be identified either with an EID or a visual tag, the exception being Victoria, where they have mandatory EID for sheep and goats. I will mention now that while the government has announced that EID will be implemented nationally for sheep and goats, the implementation is currently being worked through, and it's the responsibility of each state and territory to roll out EID in their respective jurisdiction. Now, once livestock are tagged, the tag needs to remain with the animal for its lifetime. If a tag stops working or falls out, the animal needs to be re-tagged. If the animal is on the property it was born on, it can be re-tagged with a breeder tag, and if it's not on the property of birth, it can be tagged with a post-breeder tag. The tip here is to ensure you have adequate NLIS accredited tags, both breeder and post-breeder, and that animals are tagged before they leave your property. The third component of NLIS is recording livestock movements in the database. As all cattle in Australia and sheep and goats in Victoria have an EID, they're generally scanned using a reader and then the list of tags uploaded to the database to record the movement from one PIC to another. This can also be done manually with a list of tags or using third-party software. Sheep and goats identified with visual tags are recorded in the database as mob-based movements. This is uploaded to the database to record the number of head being moved from one PIC to another. Movements should be recorded in the database as quickly as possible. Generally, the transfer needs to be completed in 48 hours of the physical movement occurring, noting that some states and territories have slightly different timeframe requirements. It is the responsibility of the person receiving the livestock to ensure the movement of the livestock has been transferred in the database. Now, if livestock are bought or sold through a sale yard, the sale yard will do the transfer. If livestock are directly consigned to an abattoir, the abattoir will do the transfer. However, for private sales, that is property to property, where the sale yard's not involved, the buyer or receiver of the livestock must record the movement in the database. And there's some things to note about this. The person sending or selling the livestock is not obligated to record the movement off their property. It's always good to check though it's being done. And selling platforms like Auctions Plus do not complete livestock transfers. So if you are using an agent or a sale yard to complete transfers, it's important to check that this has occurred by requesting from them an upload ID. You can also create an NLAS account to check all movement records to and from your pick and to make sure the movements are correct. Additionally, all livestock consignments must be accompanied by a movement record, such as an LPA NVD. The NVD serial number can also be recorded on the NLAS transfer to further assist with traceability. States and territories may also require additional documentation for livestock consignments, including waybills or animal health declarations. If transfers and movement records are not completed correctly, traceability is lost, which will lead to delays when trying to trace livestock in emergency disease outbreaks. The data is simply not in the system. So if you don't have an NLAS account, producers can create one. NLAS accounts are free to open and operate, and there are instructions for setting up the account available on our website. Once you have an NLAS account, producers can perform several functions on the database. You can move livestock on or off your pick, check for transfers have been completed, check active devices that are on your pick, correct any transfer errors. You can run reports, complete a pick reconciliation if you have an EID, and most importantly, the most important thing you can do, is to check that every transfer on and off your pick is there. And if there is a difference or an error, you need to follow up with it and investigate it straight away. One of the most serious issues that NLAS is when livestock movements are not recorded in the database. Livestock lose their traceability if this occurs, and this gap is also an enormous risk in the event of a disease outbreak, as infected livestock movements may have occurred and we're not able to trace them. The best way to prevent this from happening is to check every transfer is completed correctly when livestock are moved on and off your pick. If you have an NLAS account and you receive warning emails regarding livestock transfers, it will likely relate to a transfer not being completed either onto or off your pick. If you have an NLAS account and use electronic identification devices to identify your animals, you can conduct what's called a pick reconciliation. This process identifies discrepancies between the number of devices physically on your property against those that are registered to your pick on the database. Completing a pick reconciliation helps ensure that all transfers have been completed correctly. The first step is to account for all the active devices that you have. This includes those that you've already put onto animals, and then that might be in the cupboard or in the shed. Generally, you do this when you're mustering or bringing the animals into the yards. They can then be scanned to create a list of active devices. This list then gets uploaded via the pick reconciliation function in the database, and the system performs a check for you. Once it's completed, you'll get an email with a list of any devices that require some action. So you might have to activate, transfer, or set some to inactive. And this will ensure that you have a current and active list of devices on your pick. So now I've run through what you can do under NLAS, I just wanted to touch on livestock movement documentation. All consignments of livestock must be accompanied with movement records, such as an LPA NVD. And access to these NVDs is only possible if you're LPA accredited. So I'm just going to explain how livestock movement and NVD requirements under LPA work in with NLAS. So as a quick recap, LPA has 7 requirements that accredited producers must meet. They relate to property risk assessments, animal treatments, stock foods and pasture records, preparation for dispatch, livestock transactions and movements, biosecurity and animal welfare. Producers need to check that they are always meeting the requirements under LPA, However, I'm going to run through the livestock transactions and movement as it's most relevant to traceability. So LPA requires that producers ensure livestock movements between properties or PICs are accompanied by a current, correctly completed LPA NVD. Sufficient records need to be maintained for purchased livestock and livestock dispatched off the property that reconciles with the NLIS. And you need to ensure that livestock are identified with NLIS identification devices and that your transfers have been completed in the database. This basically means that you need an NVD for each movement off a PIC and a copy of NVDs for any livestock that are brought onto your PIC. NVDs can be paper-based or electronic or an eNVD, and they must be completed accurately, correctly, and in full to ensure that the accurate information is being provided to support traceability. So to recap, the actions that you can take now in relation to livestock movement records and traceability include checking your PIC is valid and updating contact details with your state or territory authority. Create an NLIS account if you don't have one, and make sure your contact details remain current. Maintain your LPA accreditation to ensure you have access to LPA NVDs. Order NLIS accredited tags. Ensure your movement records on NLIS are up to date or check transfers have been completed. Conduct a PIC reconciliation if you use EID, and complete accurate NVDs for livestock moved off your PIC, and keep copies of NVDs for livestock on your PIC. ISC have loads of resources on our website and even videos on how to do things in the NLIS database. Our customer service centre is also available to help you with anything NLIS or LPA related if you aren't familiar with the system. So remember, accurate livestock movements mean we can trace animals quickly in the event of a disease outbreak and take action to prevent it spreading. It's critical to get this right to help protect our industry. That's all from me on the importance of accurate movement records for the moment, so I'll hand it back to you. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That's a great rundown of the detail and process behind the Integrity Systems Program, NLIS, and the livestock movements. Those contact details are really important, and I'm going to make sure we've got them included in the follow-up communication. So particularly that last slide, make sure they're going to go out with the follow-up form, so everybody has those at the end. If they've got any questions or follow-ups, we'll answer some of those questions tonight as well. So next up, we've got Rob Barwell. So Rob's with Animal Health Australia, and he's going to talk in a bit more detail about one of those components that Elizabeth touched on around implementing good farm biosecurity practices. Over to you, Rob.
Okay, hopefully that's up there now. Thank you, Jason, and thanks MLA and Integrity Systems Company for having me on this evening. And yes, my presentation will definitely complement Elizabeth's presentation, because the two are definitely linked by security and traceability. All right, I just lost my.
You've got your seconds. You're back on your first slide now, Rob.
So I just. No, that's not going to work. Okay, soldier on. Okay, so biosecurity is being seen more and more as a shared responsibility. We've been hearing a lot recently about what the Commonwealth has been doing at the border and with our neighbours with the current FMD and LSD outbreaks in Indonesia. States and territory governments also manage the state-specific legislation around biosecurity, and also look after biosecurity within each jurisdiction. There are industry surveillance and assurance programs out there that are available And I guess most importantly, the bedrock of the biosecurity system is the on-farm biosecurity planning that I'm here to talk to you this evening about. Sorry, I'm just lost my. That's what I mean. Sorry about that, everyone. So what is on-farm biosecurity? Farm biosecurity is a set of measures designed to protect the property from the entry and spread of diseases, pests, and weeds. Farm biosecurity is the responsibility of every person who owns, visits, or works on a property. In the current environment, it's important to focus on what you can control, which is the biosecurity for your own property. The Farm Biosecurity website is a collaboration between Animal Health Australia and Plant Health Australia and has a wealth of information for producers to be able to use developing a plan for their property. On-farm biosecurity is risk analysis with practical measures. Every business is different, so it's important that every producer looks at their own property and flock and herd, identifies the risks for them, and implements practical measures to reduce those identified risks. How can good biosecurity benefit you? Managing risk, pre-farm gate assessments to support decision-making and prevent a problem from coming onto your property. Link with ongoing surveillance to ensure disease is detected quickly if it does occur. Can lead to increased productivity through endemic disease management, which in turn should lead to increased profitability. Gives you the ability to demonstrate your on-farm practices to purchase of livestock and their product. Why have a biosecurity plan? To reduce the risk of pest, weed, or disease incursion on your property. Helps you to implement practices outlined in your plan, resulting in an immediate, ongoing, and cumulative return on your investment. Can lead to quicker recovery and losses being minimised if the disease event does occur. It's required for on-farm assurance programs such as livestock production assurance, as Elizabeth has just said. And in some jurisdictions, states have introduced additional regulations to address potentially biosecurity risks of unauthorised entry to places where animals are kept if the biosecurity management plan is in place. How to develop a biosecurity plan? The document itself is designed to help you capture what you're doing on farm to minimise the risk of a pest or disease incursion. There are many templates out there that you can use. For example, Farm Biosecurity at the website I mentioned before, Livestock Production Assurance has plans and various tools you can use. Others include BioCheck, which the Australian cattle veterinarians have developed. When you're preparing an on-farm biosecurity plan, you first need to determine what you want to achieve through implementing your biosecurity plan. What is your goal? Assess your risks. What is the likelihood and consequence of a pest, disease, and weed incursion? Capture what you're already doing to minimize risks in the biosecurity plan. Create an action plan to prioritize the improvements to your on-farm biosecurity, and review your plan at least annually. So in the biosecurity plan, there's various things that you'll need to include. You'll need to have a detailed property map. We've also broken down many of the things that you could be considering in the plan into the 6 essentials. So we've inputs, people, vehicles and equipment, production practices, pests and weeds, outputs, and training, planning, and recording. I'm going to focus on the first 4 this evening due to time. The last 2 are still important, but I want to but I'll cover the previous 4 in more detail. There's a wealth of information on the Farm Biosecurity website, as well as the National Farm Biosecurity Manual, whose image is on the right. So essential number 1 is inputs. By far the most common way of a disease being brought onto a property is with introduced animals, whether purchased or on agistment. By animals from trusted sources, and ideally with a National Animal Health Declaration. They're available for cattle, sheep, goats, and even alpacas. Isolating animals when they arrive is vital. Start with a couple of days in a holding area to allow them to empty out and any weed seeds to pass. They should then be moved to an area where you can monitor them for a while before they are moved elsewhere on the property. This period will vary depending on what you're looking for, but a few weeks is recommended. NLIS requirements need to be updated, as Elizabeth told us in her presentation. Stock feed coming onto the property is another thing to focus on. Is it free of weed seeds, fit for purpose, and right for the animals it's being fed to? The soil feeding ban in particular is important, as this practice has been a cause of spread of foot and mouth disease in many overseas countries. And don't forget water. Essential number 2, people, vehicles, and equipment. So obviously we're all seeing them more and more, but if you don't have one, you should consider installing farm biosecurity signs on gates so visitors know what they need to do or who they need to call before coming on. Implement entry and exit procedures for those that are coming on. Restrict access of people, vehicles, and equipment to the production areas of your property. Assess the risk of those visitors and machinery that's coming on. E.g., do they have regular contact with other animals, or have they been overseas recently? Barley being a case in point at the moment. And keep records of those visitors, including areas they visited. Again, pointing to the Farm Biosecurity website, there are a number of resources like gate signs that you can purchase through that, or a page on how to develop your own footpath, as well as action planners and other videos and tools on biosecurity. Minimise letting of vehicles, machinery, and equipment to others. Essential number 3 is the production practices on your property. First of all, identify pests and diseases that your property is currently free of. Monitor your livestock regularly, looking for unusual clinical signs, and increase that monitoring during periods of higher risk. For example, after rain, when insect numbers may increase. Report any unusual signs of disease in your livestock. If you think something is wrong, contact your local vet, animal health officer, or the emergency animal disease hotline. The 1-800 number at the bottom of the screen is one that everybody should have programmed into their phone. Other production practices that need to be done on farm, ensuring that carcass disposal is appropriate, all chemicals and vaccines are used according to their instructions and are recorded. Make sure that boundary fences are in good condition and that dumps and dead animal pits are fenced off so stock and feral animals cannot access them. Also ensure that carcass disposal is appropriate where it's possible. Essential number 4 is pests and weeds. Identify the feral animals, pests and weeds of significance to your district and their potential impact on your property. Identify weed affected areas on the property and implement controls to prevent the spread of those weeds. And work with neighbours and regional groups on management of feral animals. Some good examples of national level management plans that are implemented in regions around the country are the National Feral Pig Action Plan and the National Wild Dog Action Plan. Having developed your plan, it's important to review it. It's recommended that you're at least doing that annually, or when the risk for your property changes, when management practices change, or you experience a disease, pest, or weed, not weak, outbreak on your property. Obviously, everyone at the moment probably should be reviewing their biosecurity plan with the concern around potential EADs. The biosecurity plan should also include an emergency animal disease plan, and staff should be aware of what needs to happen were there to be an EAD outbreak or the suspicion of an EAD. This is just an example of one, but it can be obviously tailored to your property. So key messages around biosecurity planning for your property is that having a biosecurity plan is important to know how you are preventing pests, weeds, and diseases from entering your property. Understanding what would happen in an emergency animal disease incursion can help you plan for the worst. And the better the biosecurity plan, the more likely it is to be able to get back to business sooner. Of course, the famous adage that prevention is better than cure. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Some great messages there, and that particularly the piece about what do you do, and I think that's an important part of the webinar this evening is the information about how do we be prepared and what action do we take to keep our properties as safe as we possibly can, and how do we be as well prepared as possible. And I know there's a few questions there that will be a bit more specific about some of those actions to pick up in 15 or 20 minutes or so once we've heard from Samantha. So I'd like to hand over to Samantha Allen from Animal Health Australia, and those of you who are on the first webinar will have also heard from Samantha then. There's been a lot of commentary and discussion, and in some cases concern, about what happens if if the worst of the fears and we end up with an exotic animal disease in Australia, what happens immediately? And that first 72 hours is what Samantha is going to give us a rundown on this evening. So handing over to you.
Thanks, Jason. Can someone just give me a nod? Can you see the presentation?
Sure can.
Great. All right. Thanks so much. Well, yes, I'm talking about what happens if the worst happens and we get a diagnosis of foot and mouth disease in Australia. And I guess one of the things that I want to try and do tonight is to reassure people that we are well prepared to defend Australia against emergency animal disease. We do have robust plans in place. We have the cost sharing deed, and we've had these things ready to go for the past 20 years. We also have a pool of experienced, trained people in the jurisdictions and in the industries, and they're ready to mobilise in the event of an outbreak of a disease. And the group of people has had prior experience with eradicating many diseases in the past, including the very large equine influenza outbreak in 2007 and multiple avian influenza outbreaks, with the most recent one in 2020. I should remind you all as well that we've successfully responded to multiple plant emergency diseases and also aquatic emergency diseases. So the principles of the response are the same regardless of the agent. So if I move on, first of all, to AusVet Plan, it's our emergency response plan, and it's actually a series of manuals that set out the agreed national policies and guidelines that will guide the response to 60 emergency animal diseases. The manuals and the supporting documents are all available online. And if you want to scan the QR code, you can have a look at the website and view the documents for yourself later and see what a comprehensive range of materials we have. There's the response strategies for the individual diseases. There's operational manuals. There's enterprise manuals that talk about different industries. And there's also resources that explain how to set up control centres, how to do disinfection and all sorts of things. So it's all there ready to go, and they have been used before. The response strategies for each disease are regularly reviewed, and this is done by an expert writing group where we have representatives from government and also the relevant industries. And the foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease AusVet Plan manuals are currently under review. And actually, I should say the lumpy skin disease one has just been finished and will be published in the next 24 hours. And the reason that we do that is just to make sure that they have the most up-to-date and accurate information there. I should also say too that the foot and mouth disease one, which is available on the website at the moment, is still very technically sound. And if anybody would like to have a look at it after the webinar, if you want information about the virus, how it spreads, Australia's policy about how we'll go about handling the disease, it won't change very much in the updated manual. The sections that are being updated at the moment are really about national agreement on some key movement controls and things like that. So, feel free to have a look at what's there now or, later this evening. So the other thing that's really important is the Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement, or you might have heard that called the EADRA. The EADRA is, it's unique in the world. It was signed in 2002. And the great thing about it is that it enables Australia to stand up an emergency response in a very short time. There are 24 signatories to the EADRA, and they represent the Australian and the state and territory governments and the key livestock industry peak councils. And what the EADRA does is it provides a framework for decision making about the response approach, like what will the plan be, how will we roll it out, and it also contains the agreements for how the costs of the response will be shared amongst all of the affected parties to the EADRA. And again, there's a QR code there if people want to have a look at that later this evening, because that's publicly available too. And just so that you can see there as well, that's the parties to the EADRA, the industries at the top, and then the Australian governments as well. So I'll move on then to what happens in an outbreak, because I think that's what everybody's really most interested in. And although the flowchart on the screen is quite small, you can access that on the Animal Health Australia website if you want to have a look at it in detail yourself later. But the reason it's there is I just wanted to show everybody that that is the process that we follow in any emergency animal disease. So whether it would be African swine fever, whether it's avian influenza, we follow this pathway. We've used it before and it works. So I might just zoom into the orange section, which is the first step, and that's the reporting of the emergency animal disease. And I guess that starts with the producer, a vet, or it could be anybody that's just around animals. And we're really relying on everyone to be aware of the signs of foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease. And if you see something unusual, you can either ring the hotline. It's manned 24 hours. You will speak to a veterinarian who will be able to give you some advice and decide whether, a visit needs to be done. Or you could talk to your private vet, or you could talk to your government vet as well, depending on where you are and what the, what the local situation is. So when somebody rings, and says that they suspect a serious disease, even if it's a private vet, they will escalate that up to the government veterinary system, and then an investigation will start. If a government vet is concerned and thinks that there's a high chance that it is an emergency disease, one of the first things they'll do is notify the chief veterinary officer of that state or territory, and a formal investigation process will start. So what happens next is that samples will be collected and they'll be sent to the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness, which is Australia's national laboratory, which is down in Geelong. And the Australian Chief Veterinary Officer will also be notified. And the reason for that is that in the background then, the Australian Chief Vet will notify the people who are on the Consultative Committee for Emergency Animal Disease, or it's also called the CCEAD. And the CCEAD is the technical committee which meets within the first 24 hours of confirmation of an emergency disease, and they review the response plan. So in the first 24 hours, the chief vet of the state or territory where the disease has been found, they will be working with their team to develop the emergency response plan. So that has to happen in the first 24 hours, and they use AusVet plan. So that's why we make so much effort to make sure that AusVet plan is technically correct and that all of the states and territories and the affected industries agree with the measures that are in it. So the response plan will be drafted in the first 24 hours. The CCEAD committee will meet. They will review the plan, they'll discuss it. Everybody has a chance to have input to it, including the industry bodies. And once they're all satisfied that that is the best plan for the scenario that we're faced with, it is then referred up to the higher level committee, and that's called the National Management Group, or the NMG. And the people on the NMG will be the heads of the government departments and also the heads of the livestock industry bodies as well. And that group had the job of accepting the technical plan and then also signing off and agreeing that they will pay for the cost of the response and the cost of the compensation as well. So that's, I suppose, the legal and technical side of what's happening. In the meantime, there's a lot of activity happening on the ground as well. So again, I just thought I'd put the QR code up for the FMD AusVet plan if people want to have a look at that later. And I'll just go through a little bit about what happens. I won't say too much about the disease because I hope everybody's already done a little bit of homework and they know a bit about foot and mouth disease by now. But just to remind you all, it's a fast-moving, highly infectious disease of cloven-hoofed animals. So cattle, buffalo, pigs, sheep, goats and deer can all be affected. And it's a highly, highly contagious disease. The virus can be spread in the air that animals breathe out. And that's particularly the case with pigs. They can produce a lot of virus and they breathe it out and it can get out, into the airstreams and spread that way. Other animals, the disease is spread more through secretions like saliva and any body fluids. It's also important to remember that it's not a disease that can infect people. And as Rob and I think Elizabeth mentioned, it's now in barley, it's quite close. And I wanted to mention as well that we do have a vaccine bank available. And there has been, I suppose, a lot of media about that. The vaccine bank is not in Australia, it's held overseas, for disease security reasons, it's overseas, but it can be activated within 7 business days and be landed here in Australia, ready to be used in a response. So our response strategy for FMD, number one is that we want to make a rapid response. So we've got our AusVet plan and we've got IADRA. Our aim is to eradicate the disease as fast as possible. And we also want to minimise the social and economic impacts as well. So I guess that's where biosecurity plans come into place and having the NLIS database as good as we can get it, because it means we can be fast. The quicker we can delimit how far the disease has got, we'll be able to get in there, remove the infected animals, which is what we call stamping out. We'll also use the National Livestock Standstill as a tool to help us get ahead of the curve in the first 72 hours. And then after that, we will have declared areas and movement controls in, certain areas of the state or country, depending on what we've found out, during that standstill period. And as I said, vaccination is also another tool that may be used in a response. It's not guaranteed to be used, but it's a tool that is there. And the CCEAD committee will be the ones that decide whether vaccination is appropriate for the situation that we're faced for. And we won't know until the time. So a little bit about the livestock standstill. I know people are quite concerned about what it might mean. How do you comply with it? And so what will happen as soon as we believe that we have foot and mouth disease in the country, a standstill will be declared. It will be across the country. Every state and territory will enact it, but it will be done through the legislation of each individual state and territory. It will be initially for 72 hours. And what it means is that there can be no new journeys started for any susceptible animals. So if they're on your property, they need to stay there. Even if they're at a sale yard, they need to stay there. And for any animals that are on the road at the time that the standstill is called, the general rule will be that you have 4 hours to complete your journey. So as long as you're not needing to cross the state border, you could continue to your destination. For some movements that might not be possible. Say if you have a mixed consignment of animals, the person that was going to receive them, may not be willing to take them. Another option might be that if animals are on the road and you've got more than 4 hours to go, you can potentially return home to the place of origin. And for people that might have a problem, let's say they were planning to cross a state border, or they've got a mixed consignment of animals, or say an abattoir might close its doors and say that they're not taking any more animals in. People that are in that situation will need to ring. It'll be like the disease hotline. There'll be a number for people to call if they, need advice, and biosecurity officers will tell you what to do, issue a permit if it's needed. So there will be advice and instruction on, what to do to minimise the risk. So I think I've covered that. The 4 hours to make the journey. And if anybody's not sure, there will be advice, you know, for specific cases. So I guess the purpose of the standstill, as I mentioned, was to give the authorities 72 hours to be able to do investigation and tracing and try and get a very clear idea of how many properties are affected, how many livestock movements have happened, how big is the area that we think is affected, how many species, all that kind of information that we need. So in 72 hours, a lot has to happen. And once we have that information, the authorities will then be able to make a decision whether they can relax the restricted areas. I think the objective will be to try and shrink those down to as small a size as possible while still, you know, maintaining the ability to run the response. So at the end of the 72 hours, it's possible that it could be extended if we find that the outbreak is extensive and we still have a lot more tracing and investigation to go before we've got a clear idea on, you know, what's happening. If we're lucky and it's a smaller outbreak, we might find after 72 hours that we've got quite a clear idea. You know, it might just be in one state or territory, it might just be in a localized area. And in that case, the restricted area and control area will be brought down to a small enough size that we're confident that we've got the high risk areas contained, and then we can relax some of the movements for the rest of the country to, you know, start to get a little bit back to normal. So just to explain a little bit about control areas, the diagram on the screen, it's stylized. It's there, it's drawn as circles just so that it's easy to explain. So the restricted area in the middle is the highest risk area, and that's where we know that there are infected animals, where there's been movements of infected animals, or where there could be local spread of disease. And so the strongest restrictions will be on that area. The next area out is called the control area, and that is an area where we, you know, we believe that there is risk. There might be some tracings that we haven't had a chance to investigate yet, or other factors that make us believe that there's higher risk in that area. And then outside of that is the area where we believe is free of disease, and we call that the outside area. And there's more information in the AusVet plan if you want to have a look at that. There's what we call matrices, which tell you what sort of movements will be allowed in the restricted areas and the control areas and the outside areas, and movements in between those. And they're a guide. We can't really give producers definite answers to questions about movement restrictions without actually knowing the exact scenario that we're dealing with. But if you want to have a look at the AusVet plan, it will give you a bit of a guide as to what sort of things will have their movements restricted. And, you know, as you can probably imagine, in the restricted areas, very little things will be allowed to move. In the control areas, there will be a little bit more movement. And in the outside areas, there'll be quite, not free movement, but a lot more movement, especially if it's only within the outside area, not having any contact with the control or restricted areas. So again, after this livestock standstill, which will be the initial 72 hours, they'll be looking at being able to release some of the movement restrictions to allow, you know, normal movements to take place, you know, to allow normal supply of food and other things like that, both for people and also for animals that are affected by the standstill too. It's also important to note that while it's mainly susceptible animals that are the risk, in some cases there'll be animal products which will also be considered high risk and will be restricted either during the standstill or after. So the list here is not fully comprehensive, but to give you an idea, things like semen and embryos might be restricted, meat and milk, movement of dead stock, effluent or byproducts if they normally move off a property. Vehicles that have been in contact with infected animals will need to be decontaminated really thoroughly. Movement of wool and fibre can be affected. There'll probably be restrictions for people as well. If you've been in contact with infected animals, you'd probably be required to shower, shampoo your hair and change into clean clothes. Similar for horses or dogs that have been in contact with infected animals as well, if you need to move them off the property. But there'll be really clear instructions from the authorities at the time. And I think that was pretty much what I needed to cover, Jason. I'm happy to take any questions at the end.
That's great, Samantha. Thank you, and very much a care for what you wish for as far as questions go. There's quite a few coming through, and as we mentioned at the start, the Q&A function, we're answering some of those questions live, so being able to type in answers, but we'll also answer a number of those through Q&A session that we have now. So we've got a bit of time to work through that. And we might just have a quick couple of follow-ups with you to get started. Samantha, there's a lot of discussion about vaccines and the use of vaccines. So it's a bit of a multi-part question. So 3 parts to it. Is the FMD vaccine already available in Australia? Can farmers access it, or do we have to wait? And if FMD gets in, how quick is the response to be able to get vaccines?
Okay, thanks, Jason. I can answer those. And I guess the first one is that we don't have the vaccine in the country, and it's really important that it would have trade and market access impacts if we did bring the vaccine in, or if we started using it. Even if we didn't have disease in the country at the time, our trading partners might doubt our disease-free status and might just close markets anyway. And so that would have a really negative impact on, Australia's economy and livestock industries anyway. So the decision's been made that we'll hold our vaccine bank offshore. And it's actually a pretty clever arrangement because FMD virus has many different strains. It's a little bit like flu in people. By having our vaccine bank offshore, it gives us the option to be able to order the exact vaccine that we need, depending on which virus ends up in the country. With FMD vaccines, it's really similar to flu. You've got to use the correct one for the virus that you've got, otherwise it's not effective. So by having that overseas, as I mentioned in that flowchart, when we get the samples going down to the ACDP, one of the things that they will then do is organise for the virus to be typed. As soon as we know the type, we place the order with the vaccine manufacturer, and our contract agreement with them is for them to have the vaccine ready to use here in the country within 7 working days. We also have a stockpile of special vaccine guns and things to go with it. So it gives, I suppose, the authorities 7 days to develop their plan, figure out exactly where they'll be wanting to use vaccine, and then we will be able to ship it exactly where it needs to go. So I think that will work really well.
Right, thank you. That's it's good information to have about the availability of the vaccine and the reasons why we don't have it here on hand. And I guess it does also highlight the fact that we don't have foot and mouth disease in Australia and haven't had for a very, very long time. So a bit of a follow-up, if FMD does come into the country, can we completely eradicate it? And if so, what would the expected time frame be?
Oh, Jason, that is a really hard question. I think I am an optimist. So I'd have to say that we need to start out believing that we can eradicate. And I might throw back to the equine influenza outbreak that we had in 2007. And I mean, that was huge. It was across, 2 states to a large extent, and Victoria were also very worried. There were times during that response that we weren't sure if we were going to be successful or not, but we followed our plans. We did, everything that we could, and it was industry and the government responders all working together, I think, that made that a success. Foot and mouth disease is frightening because we know that it can spread very quickly. But I do believe if we have everybody on board, if we've got the industries and the livestock producers and government as well, if we can get it early, that will make the biggest difference. So I would just urge everyone to please be checking your animals regularly, and don't be afraid to ring the hotline if you're not sure. We would much, much rather have a false alarm than have somebody feel embarrassed or unsure and not ring, and maybe put us a few days to a week behind on the investigation.
Yeah, it's a really good point, isn't it? That immediacy is incredibly important, and I think the point you made right at the start of your presentation about how long these plans have been in place, and they get reviewed and updated, and which is absolutely happening now. That's one of the benefits of having the heightened level of awareness and concern that we have now about these exotic diseases, that we do update these plans, but the success of the plans and the success of being able to get in front of these things absolutely relies on early detection and swift action. So that's incredibly important. So those numbers and contacts that Animal Health Australia has provided previously are really important. There's a couple of questions about specific information from the presentations, and we'll actually circulate all of the presentations, the information from those afterwards. So anybody who's registered on the webinar will get that information and we'll make sure you've got all of that available to you. But also make sure you share that in your networks as well. So getting the message out as quickly as we can will be really important. So a question for Rob. We've still got Rob there. So there's quite a bit of discussion about disinfectant and foot baths, Rob. So a connected question you've got is about, what measures should we be taking now with regards to visitors to our property? So could you just comment on and picking a couple of those things out of your presentation about measures that we should be taking regarding visitors now, and maybe include any comments about foot baths and types of disinfectants?
Yeah, sure, Jason. So I guess firstly with disinfectants, which have been notable in the media recently with the foot mats at the border, etc. I guess as far as the farm goes, it's really important to note that the first thing is you've got to remove any foreign material you can see on objects such as tyres or boots, such as soil, mud, manure, etc. All those disinfectants aren't going to be particularly useful. Then it's a case of what you're trying to keep out and what you have to put the chemicals in. There's a web page on the Farm Biosecurity website that's dedicated to foot baths. So if anyone's interested in learning what to do, I'd recommend you go there to get that information. I guess specifically, there's obviously interest around foot and mouth disease and what might be effective against that. And there's certainly a number of things. Citric acid is what they're using in the foot pads at the airports, but there's a number of other things, including Burcon. And I'd also just say that it's always important to follow the instructions and the safety data sheets for the chemicals. These things are only as useful as the way they're intended to be used. As far as visitors at the moment, again, lots of interest in that about those returning to Australia, international visitors, but on the farm, there's probably things that should be done all the time, not just when we're a bit worried about FMD at the border. So I guess this is more around visitors to your production areas and those that might go to where the livestock are on your property, not necessarily those that are just going to the house, like family and friends. And the focus, is obviously initially around where have those visitors already been? Have they been overseas recently? That's obviously going to raise a flag if they're looking to come onto your property. Have they been on other farms recently, particularly on the same day? And then obviously around the boots and equipment, vehicle type things when you're sort of greeting them at the entrance, which hopefully they've alerted you to the fact they're coming on. So all of those things need to be done. And then of course, recording the visitors in your visitor log or register is important. And you might include, you might have an induction process as well for those that are coming on, and that could include some basic biosecurity along with work health and safety.
That's great, thank you. So there's a few of those things that we can do just as part of normal practice, which aren't necessarily that onerous. And you mentioned that Farm Biosecurity website. Is there a link to that website in your presentation that people will see?
Yes, you might have noticed a few QR codes spread throughout the presentation, and then they'll link off to either the Farm Biosecurity website itself or to a couple of relevant pages there.
Right, so that's great. And in a number of the presentations, there's going to be information and links, and as Rob mentioned, those QR codes, which will then take you through to additional details. So that's great. Thank you for that. So Elizabeth, you still with us?
Yep, I'm here.
A couple of questions about accuracy of data and information. So, and I think Samantha did provide you with a good lead in for this about the importance of accuracy in our data movement management process. So do you just want to comment on just how important it is to have accurate NLIS database information when we're trying to manage an exotic animal disease?
Yeah, it's critical. Without the data, we don't know where animals are or have been, and we can't trace them. It's similar to the thinking of how they traced with COVID, right? We were checking in everywhere letting them know where we were so they could let us know if we come into contact with someone with COVID. So it's the same concept, just applied to livestock and PICs and IDs and transfers. So it's critical to track and trace animals. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good example, isn't it? It's amazing how quickly we became comfortable with sharing our information when they said, unless you share your information, you can't eat. And obviously we can't motivate the cows in the same way, but we need to get the message across to all of us that manage livestock movements that it's just as important as far as our preparedness is concerned. There's also a few comments and questions, I suppose, about the NLIS database and how up to date it is, and particularly about some delay in transfers and where that responsibility sits. But what as an industry can we do at a high level or as a process to ensure that our records are accurate?
Take responsibility for your transfers when you're buying livestock, making sure that your transfers are completed, and if you're using agents or third parties to check to make sure that they've done it, because at the end of the day, under the legislation, the person receiving the livestock is responsible, and you can actually get penalties and things like that from your state. So it's important that everyone steps up, takes responsibility for what they should be doing, and we're here to help you as well. So we can help teach you and show you and do all of that stuff as well. So it's important to be responsible and do your transfers.
So just very specifically, who has responsibility for that transfer in a transaction, and then in a livestock movement like a property to property? Sure.
So if the person receiving the livestock, so if I'm buying sheep from Sam, I'm responsible for the transfer. If Rob's buying cattle from me, he's responsible for the transfer. Sale yards will do the transfer and responsible if you're using the sale yard, and abattoirs if they're receiving the livestock. But generally, the legislation says the person who's receiving or buying the livestock is the one that's responsible for that transfer.
Yeah, I think that's a good example for everyone to be conscious of. If someone historically does all their transactions through a sale yard, chances are the sale yard, the buying and selling, has done those livestock movements for them. So the database has been updated on their behalf as part of that sale service. And if they then make a private sale or purchase, then the responsibility for that transfer is different. And so it's important to be conscious of where that responsibility sits in.
Yeah, definitely.
Sam, there's a follow-up on, Samantha, there's a follow-up on vaccines. So there's a lot of discussion about vaccine. And you did touch on it, but would you mind just talking again, please, about the specifics of why the vaccine isn't here in Australia now?
Yeah, sure, Jason. The main, well, I suppose there's two reasons, is that we want to make sure we get the correct vaccine to match the outbreak that we have. So if we ordered vaccine today just to have it on hand to be safe, there'd be a small chance that we've ordered the wrong one. And so if an outbreak happened, we could potentially have vaccine that's not going to be effective. We'd have to wait and order more. So we may not be in a better position. And then the second one, and probably the most important, is that the message, like how that would be interpreted by our trading partners. I think most people are aware that in Australia, we export most of the animal products that we produce. So maintaining our export markets is really important. If we ordered vaccine, whether we used it or not, I think it would make some of the trading partners concerned that we might have an outbreak that we hadn't reported, and their reaction may be to close export markets. So I think that's basically the reason. I think that we feel comfortable that if we've got that 7 days lead time, we can get vaccine here quickly. It won't slow down a response, and it doesn't have any impact then on potential trade or how things look to our partners.
All right, so there's three really clear messages there, isn't there? So one is we have a vaccine bank, which is specific for us and dedicated for us. We own, it's dedicated for Australian use.
Yes.
And it's accessible quickly.
Yes.
The next one is that we need to know the strain, the specific strain, if we were ever to have an outbreak, that we were responding to, so that we could ensure that we have the most effective vaccine.
Yes, that's correct, Jason. There's a panel of national and international experts that advises us on what options we should have in our vaccine bank. So the vaccine bank sits there. There's a range of options that we can select from that's been we've been advised by world experts. And so then, we feel quite confident that we're covered, but we need to know what the virus is before we actually order the vaccine to get it here in the country.
And then the third one is the comments you were making about market access. And I think the way I think about this is that the use of foot and mouth disease vaccine is to prevent or eradicate in the case of an outbreak. And if we were to have the vaccine here, it's very hard to maintain our position and keep our trading partners confident that we either don't have an outbreak or we're not expecting one to be imminent. And so we've tried to manage that risk of not having vaccine on hand by having the bank available to us, and that allows us to still give all of our trading partners confidence, but actually have ready access to a vaccine if we ever were to have an outbreak.
Yeah, exactly right, Jason.
Right. Okay, so I reckon we'll probably have another go around on vaccines before we get to the end, because it is a really important one, because it's such a key component for how we might respond.
Yeah.
Rob, just a couple of other ones for you, and we very quickly get down to some of the detail in biosecurity plans. So there's a couple of questions about unusual structures or unusual setups around property. So if there's a road running through the middle of a property, or there's an easement, how do people manage their biosecurity plans where you don't necessarily have as much control, or you have a like you say, a road that runs through your property that provides an increased level of risk?
Yeah, that's quite a common question, and obviously, people can't stop people from accessing those roads as a right of way. So it's more around managing the risk of having that on or next to your property, rather than a blanket being able to stop it altogether. So, if it's a short distance, fencing off of the road might be an option. Keeping stock away from that area, particularly younger animals that might be more susceptible to issues. Obviously, signage on gates that might come off that road, or keeping the gates locked so that people can't move from the road into your paddocks. I guess also not as good, but at least monitoring of the verges of the road for weeds. Often the public thoroughfares are areas where weeds are likely to appear sooner, and so if you're on top of that earlier, you might stop that spread to other parts of the property. So yeah, there's definitely things you can still do.
Right, so there's things you can do, but it's tough, right? Like that does make it difficult.
Yeah, look, it's like everything in life, it's you can't make these things a zero risk. You need to be able to work out what best works for the property, and certainly, there's things you can do to manage the risk. That the next best thing, I guess, and certainly, weeds and things like that are probably more significant a risk, compared to, FMD. Very unlikely that that's going to be spread from someone driving their vehicle through on your property.
So, Rob, is the essence of this that, biosecurity plans, one of the key parts of them is monitoring and managing movement, people, livestock, machinery. So when you have exposure like an easement or a road, that certainly adds a heightened level of risk, and you are going to have to take additional measures than if you were reasonably isolated environment.
Yeah, look, it's an active thing. You can't just fill out your biosecurity plan and put it in the drawer. It's really something that you need to think carefully about what's happening on the property and what you need to do. And if you've got those areas of public access, those areas are obviously going to need more attention than your back paddock where no one ever goes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think that's really important, about And I think what I'm also taking from that is the need to actively think about what's required in our biosecurity plans. This isn't just a copy and paste exercise. We've got to be very deliberate about what we put in those plans.
Yep, they're dynamic and meant to be living documents. Yeah, the action plan's there for you to be working through when you can in a practical and realistic time frame.
Right. And the environment we're in at the moment, where there's a heightened level of awareness and concern, is the perfect time to be reviewing that. So, Elizabeth, there's a really good question here about training, and it's very specific about, can I get some support or some training in the LIS database and how to manage animals on my pick?
Yep, absolutely. So ISC is running some more webinars over the next 2 months. So we'll send out communications around that schedule. So we'll run through how to use the NLIS database, what LPA means, and how you can do all the various things you need to do in the system. So we've set that up for over the next 2 months. There'll be a number of different webinars you can join to learn. We also have how-to videos, how-to guides on our website, which you can get anytime you like and learn how to do it that way. And again, our customer support centre is available via the call centre or email if you need help with something specific as well. So yeah, training's coming available, and there's resources available as well.
Right, thank you. And there'll be links and information on how to pick up that discussion in the materials that go out afterwards. So there's another question about warning emails. Often getting warning emails from the database about animals that have moved off my pick, and what do I need to do about these?
Yeah, so a warning email indicates that there either wasn't a transfer completed, and maybe you weren't responsible for it, but something's gone wrong with that transfer. So it's always good to log into the database. If you're getting a warning email, it means you've got an account. So log in and have a look at the warning and see what it is. If you can't figure it out, you can always get in contact with us and we can help you work it through. Generally speaking, it means that traceability has been lost. It's something called a system transfer, and it just means that someone didn't do the transfer along the chain, and now traceability has been lost. So it notifies everyone that could have caused the problem, so they can go in and either try and fix it or be aware of it, so we can report on it and stop it from happening again.
Cool, thank you. Samantha, how long can FMD survive off a host? So how long can FMD survive if it's been picked up off an animal that's infected with the virus?
Yeah, I wish I could give you a simple answer, but it's complicated. The virus can survive, outside of an animal host for quite a long period of time, depending on where it is, and it can be affected by moisture levels, temperature, humidity, and pH. So if people are really interested and want to read a great deal of detail in the foot and mouth disease AusVet plan in Appendix 3, there's pages of information, and if you're interested in something very specific, you could look it up there. But say as a bit of a guide for people tonight, in dried manure, it can last 14 days. In moist manure, 8 days. It can survive for a long time in salted and cured meats. And this is one of the big risks as well. When we watch Border Force on TV and you see travellers bringing meat into the country, even things like ham, which could be perfectly fresh and fine for people to eat, the FMD can survive in ham fat for 183 days. In bacon, 190 days. Sausages up to 56 days. So this is stuff that if it's illegally imported could look perfectly fresh. People might eat it, and what they don't eat, the big risk is if they throw it over the fence or throw it to a backyard pig, that could be what starts off an FMD outbreak in Australia. So just some other information. It can be infective in the environment for several weeks, especially if there's soil, manure, dried animal secretions, or even straw, hair and leather. So I guess really if we're trying to disinfect for foot and mouth disease, the first thing is that you've got to clean the surface. And I think, Rob might have mentioned that if you're talking about footbaths and things, you can't disinfect things that are dirty. You need to clean them first. So you need to get any muck off the shoes or equipment and then apply the disinfectants. And then I guess as well for just dirty environments, you need to be aware that the virus can survive for a reasonable period of time. But Appendix 3 of the AusVet plan, if anyone wants to look up something specific, it'll be there.
It really does seem like the word of this challenge is depends, isn't it? And that's really tough when we're trying to provide direction and confidence. But that's what's so important, I think, to have access to these reference materials and know where we can make those connections. So we've talked quite a bit about the materials and information that's going to be available. There's a couple of questions about the hotline numbers. Do you just want to make a comment on that too, please, Samantha?
Yes. Was there a specific question, Jason? Or we've got the 1800 675 888. It's a national number. People can ring it 24 hours a day. It it diverts to each state or territory. So say if you're ringing from Victoria, it'll divert you to the Victorian authorities. If you're ringing from Tassie, it'll go to the Tas. So you'll be speaking to someone from the jurisdiction where you live. And some of them, it's triaged first by a call centre, and then you'll be transferred onto a veterinarian. Normally, it might be a biosecurity officer, but it will be somebody that can, they'll ask you normally a specific set of questions, and they'll use that information to then decide on how high a risk the problem is that you're reporting. And then it will get actioned. If someone rang the hotline and the person answering, I used to work in New South Wales government, and I used to take the hotline calls, and sometimes you would get one, and just talking to the person within the first couple of minutes, that it's something quite serious. You just ring the chief vet as soon as you hang up the phone and say, I think we've got a problem, and you've got the contact details and everything for the person that's called, and we just arrange a visit and go out, and it just goes from there.
Right. Okay. So it's that one key number that anybody can ring with a concern about an outbreak or any risk that they want to get advice or
yes, Jason.
notification.
It's really important for people to know it's not just for vets. Do you know, if you were, driving out in the bush and you saw something, over a fence, and you were worried about it, you can ring the hotline. With our phones, we can get an idea through GPS where we are. And when you're talking to the vet or whatever, most phones and tablets and things today, you can take a photo or a video, so you can share all that, with the expert who's on the phone, and make it really quick for them to decide whether what you're looking at is serious or not. And I just want to reiterate that people should not be afraid to ring. You won't be laughed at. You're not a nuisance. We really want you to call.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's the, if there is any risk or concern at all, then making sure you call and notify. And we'll make sure that information's in the follow-up communication about what that hotline number is. And I know that the DMLA's got some communication that's going out as well to try and get that out to as many people as possible. We all leave those up on our fridge, so we know what that number is and we can access it very quickly. Rob, a couple for you. There's been some comments about vehicles, and you mentioned vehicle movements and managing physical material as they come through. What's the best way to manage the vehicles coming and going from the farm if you don't have a washdown area, for example?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it depends what the vehicle's coming on for. If it's just driving to the homestead, then that's less of a concern than a vehicle that might be driven out into the paddocks where the livestock are, or to the yards. So that if it's to the homestead, yes, ideally even then there shouldn't be sort of tire treads full of mud and muck from other properties. But yeah, if they're coming on, if it's an agent, maybe there's the opportunity for them to switch from their vehicle to yours. If they're driving around in the paddocks, if they're a contractor who obviously has all the equipment in the vehicle, then just trying to make sure that the tyres are clean if possible. Maybe you've got a pressure gurney yourself you could use, use some disinfectant, etc., making sure that the tyres are roughly cleaned up rather than having a full washdown bay. And then, some other questions are sort of around those coming on, the utility companies, etc., who've obviously got a right of way to access power lines, etc. You obviously can't stop them coming on. So again, it's about management, hopefully they'll let you know that they're coming on before they do, or where they're going, and prioritising those areas, I guess, for checking for emergence of weeds, particularly after rain, things after they've been on. All those types of things might be things to consider.
So is it also as simple as managing within your own constraints as well? If you have a vehicle come from another property, then avoiding cross-contamination. So like you say, transfer, if it's an agent who's been somewhere else, then don't have their vehicle drive around your paddocks, transfer into your own. So there's a number of steps you can take, even if you don't necessarily have the facilities for a disinfectant or wash down. And I suppose trying to think of the analogies that can help us think about ways to solve it. It's a bit like, if it's muddy, you take your boots off before you go inside, and you can keep 100% of the mud out of the house, can't you? Even though it's very muddy just outside the door.
Yeah, and that's the same with boots under the property. Again, I've talked about the vehicles, but the same with people and boots. If someone's come from down the road and their boots are sort of full of mud, etc., then you're within your rights to get them to clean them before they go tromping around on your place. Maybe even better still, having a change of boots, for those that go from place to place, different sets of shoes, or ways of cleaning them at least between property visits. It is similar. Yeah.
Okay. So there's those practical things for us to think about. It's a bit like your biosecurity plan, isn't it? It's thinking about what the risk is and all the simple actions we can take, which will be obviously the most effective. Elizabeth, there's a few questions about unusual movements or movements that are for other activities. So taking livestock to a show where they leave the property and come back again. Are there ways to manage that easily? It seems to create challenges for both the operators of those events and also the producers as well.
Yeah, so the EC is on at the moment, but they would have their own pick in NLAS as a showground. They actually get their own and can do transfers onto their pick from producers. So each state and territory does it slightly differently in terms of if you need to do a transfer or if you need an NVD or not. So the best thing to do is check it's on our website, but also with your state and territory about what needs to happen when you're going to sporting events or shows or things like that. But generally speaking, those movements need to be recorded in the database and a movement record completed. So my advice is to each state and territory does it differently, but just there is information on our website around the specifics, and each state and territory will tell you what you need to do as well.
Yeah, that's great. And those connections are really helpful. But I think this is also a bit like the easement and the roads, isn't it? And the biosecurity plan. There's not an easy bypass solution to this. This is one of the important reminders about our biosecurity systems and responsibilities. And we need to track our movements. When we're taking livestock to a show, then thinking about where we're taking them, what we're doing with them, and what happens when we bring them home and how do we record that? That's part of the responsibility we have around our biosecurity plans. We're getting pretty close to time. Samantha, just one for you around, and I suspect it's going to have a depends component to it, but there's a lot of concern about what happens after there is a case found to the animals immediately, and quite often those conversations go to all animals being destroyed, close and within that range. And you talked about that scale and those three areas that get identified. But can you just talk a little bit about what happens immediately after if the virus is detected or disease is detected to those immediate animals or those closest to them, and what that process is?
Sure. I guess I could give a bit of an outline, Jason, if we just think about one infected property, and like we don't know how many we'll know initially. It might be just one, or the first notification might be that there's 10. But say if you're the owner of an infected property, there'll be an immediate quarantine, nothing will be able to move, and there'll also be restrictions on not just the susceptible animals, but because it's a high risk environment and we know there's virus around, there'll be restrictions on a lot of things. So infected animals, the policy in Australia is that they will be slaughtered, so that it's done humanely. The farmer doesn't have to do it themselves. It's all done by the response, and the disposal of the carcasses is handled by the response. I think there had been some misinformation out there where farmers were thinking they'd have to do it themselves, and they won't. So on an infected property, all of the susceptible animals would be humanely destroyed and disposed of. And then as part of the work that happens on the property there, they'll be looking at other things, that have been in contact. So if there's been, if grain could have been contaminated, or hay stores, or equipment that's been used on those animals, those things, if they're not able to be disinfected, would probably need to be destroyed as well. They'd be looking at what movements have happened on and off the property. The official incubation period that we use for tracing is 14 days. So we'd normally be looking 2 incubation periods back. So they'd be looking at what's gone on and off in the previous 14 days, and any property or piece of equipment that's identified in that time period would be separately investigated. So that means, if the infected property we know about had introduced animals from several sources in that period, all those source properties would then be investigated as well. And, it's possible one or more of those could be the source, and then we have another infected property. For the property that we, the original one that we're talking about, when the livestock are sorted out there would also be work going on to say, well, what's happening on the neighbour's property? Could there be, close contact between the cattle on the first property and livestock on the neighbouring property? Animals would be tested. So there's an awful lot of information being gathered when that happens. It's probably quite likely that animals on neighbouring properties will be considered high risk and might be slaughtered. It would really depend on the species, how close they are, what sort of fencing's in between. Like if you had housed cattle on one property that was the original infected property, if the boundary was 20 k's away and then the neighbour had, beef cattle, like extensive sort of beef cattle, they do a risk assessment, they do some testing. I wouldn't say to you it's guaranteed that the beef cattle would be slaughtered immediately. But, I suppose one of the highest risk things was if we had an infected piggery. We know that pigs produce 3,000 times more virus than any other animal when they're infected, and a lot of it comes out in their breath. So if we had an infected piggery and we knew that there was a dairy close by, that would be very high risk, because cattle are very susceptible. They can be infected by breathing in virus. So, in that sort of a scenario, if you were a dairy farmer very close to an infected piggery, you'd be quite worried, because there'd be a high chance that your animal's infected and they might be slaughtered. So I could say to you, there wouldn't be like a blanket destruction of every animal. There would be risk assessments done, but I think it's quite highly likely that, a lot of animals in that restricted area will be affected by the stamping out policy.
Thank you for that. I think that's an incredibly important message, where there's a lot of concern created about what would happen. And I think, just to summarise what you just said then, is that the action around quarantining the potential destruction of livestock or other associated feedstuffs, for example, is in the first case driven by positive test results and then by a risk assessment.
Yeah.
And that's done by the response team, and that's not done obviously very quickly, but it's not a blanket approach that's taken to associated nearby connected property or livestock, for example.
Yeah, that's right, Jason. It's all done science-based, risk-based. We need to get on top of the disease, but we also want to minimise the destruction and disruption that happens as well.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's really, really important. And we are out of time, and I think that's a good spot for us to start closing those pieces out, because it's such a good message that goes behind what Elizabeth and Rob have said as well about the processes and systems and structures that are in place. So a couple of the key messages are that there is significant preparation and planning has gone into our preparedness for the potential unlikely case of an exotic animal disease coming to Australia we've been planning on that for the last 20 years. We are free of foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease, and our actions and efforts are to absolutely keep it that way. And we have systems and processes in place that not just give us confidence that we will keep building and strengthening our position to keep ourselves as free from these things as possible, but also our ability to respond if the worst does happen we're very well prepared. So thank you very much, Elizabeth, Robin, and Samantha. Incredibly helpful and informative, and I think most importantly, the information that you've provided and have been so willing to share will be also provided out in the follow-up communications. The industry task force that sits behind the driving of these webinars still meets weekly, and will continue to ensure that we're running the communication and update sessions on a regular basis. And at the moment, it's been every couple of weeks, and on the task force and the broader teams, particularly AHA and as the response crew, will have a significant input into what's necessary, as well as the other organisations that are supporting the industry. And of course, look out for that follow-up information, those details, and if there's any questions or concerns or anything else that you would like to know, make sure that you pick up on some of those contact details and seek them out. So just on the questions, so there's been 90 odd questions come through in the Q&A. It's 100, and there's been about 40 or so of those have been answered, and there's about 50 or 55 that haven't, and we'll make sure there's answers to those questions that we follow up as well. So there are some specifics there, and we'll do as best as we can to get a response back to those questions, so you have as much information as possible. So thank you very much. Look out for the follow-up information, share it far and wide amongst your networks, and please take on board that advice from each of the speakers, that if you have any concerns or questions, make sure you're not afraid to sing out. And once again, thank you very much, Elizabeth, Rob, and Samantha, for giving up your time and being so helpful and informative this evening. See everybody. Have a good night.